Why would a Gwich'in person want to work a 40-hour-a-week job making money so they could turn around and go buy organic food? Like, how does that make sense to anybody? Why would you do that? So I'm gonna go work harder so then I could buy food of lower quality. Like, how does that make sense? That doesn't make sense to me. That's why we're just perplexed as to what you say when you're talking about progress. Is progress like eating Spam? Is that progress? I don't think so. You know, here down in the States, when you want to talk status, people talk about going to Whole Foods and eating organic food. That's status, right? You're saying, oh, it's important because it's important for our health to eat this healthy food. So what is all this drilling for? So that we could have money to do what? To live like Gwich'in? We already live like Gwich'in. We're not trying to change anything in that regard. You know, I think you can learn a lot by seeing how we live. You can learn a lot because we're not chasing our tails up there. And so, you know, going back to the tribal perspective is that it is our responsibility and our duty to take care of the land and take care of the animals because they've taken care of us for thousands of years. And, you know, you're going to hear Alaska Native Corporation's representatives coming up here and talk about responsible development too. And I just want to make it clear while I have the time to do such, that Alaska Native Corporations are not tribes. They are not tribes. They do not have a traditional language. Their purpose is profit. Our purpose as Gwich'in is to protect our traditional way of life and to live that traditional way of life in an honorable way. And so our elders told us.
But for the record, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I realize and recognize, as Senator Daines did, this is a long ways to travel, so thank you very much for being here. Mr. Sheehan, a couple of questions for you that came up, I think, during some of the other questions. When Congress moves forward, as we are today, if there's a lease plan developed for the 1002 area, environmental laws don't change. They're not waived. They remain the same as they are today. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Senator.
And so there would be a leasing plan that would be developed with public input. Is that correct?
Absolutely. There'd be full environmental
and so
impact.
There's environmental reviews. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
And there's analysis of how this would impact the environment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does that change as a result of the 1002 process?
No, there's nothing in that process that would allow for changing any of those environmental considerations or rules.
Will this area be going into production the day after Congress passes legislation?
We would expect that that probably lease sales, perhaps 2, would occur 4 to 5 years from now, with drilling being potentially as far out as 7 to 10 years.
So 7 to 10 years. Litigation, do you get sued, or does this waive lawsuits?
This doesn't waive lawsuits, but certainly
so
we don't like lawsuits any more than anyone else does.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is that the process of environmental protection, environmental reviews, environmental analysis doesn't change one iota. Correct?
That's true, yes.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor, the governor's opening statement talked about your extensive written testimony, lay out some of the history of the founding of Alaska, the laws that led us to the current situation, your experience working with oil and gas industry. So I got a couple questions for you. Alaska was brought into the Union as a state with understanding that it would be allowed to responsibly develop the resources available to it. Is that correct? Yes or no?
Yes.
When the compromise legislation, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, was passed in 1980, it expanded what was then known as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge by almost 9 million acres to create what we now know as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge previous to the range, now the refuge. Is that correct?
Yes.
That bill doubled the size of the national park system, doubled the size of the national refuge system, and tripled the amount of federal land designated as wilderness. Is that correct?
Yes.
That same bill, which massively expanded conservation protections for many areas of the state, also specifically set aside the coastal plain, or 1002 lands, for the scientific evaluation of its petroleum development, potential environmental qualities, and the possibility of safe development. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the studies conducted by the Department of the Interior led them to recommend Congress adopt a full oil and gas leasing program for the 1002 area. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does the United States consume more oil today than it produces? Mayor,
it does, yes.
So we still import oil today. I think that's been talked about. Is it fair to say that not all of the countries we import oil from share the same values as the United States?
Absolutely.
And I think production of domestic energy allows us greater leverage over those nations that we import oil from. So does it make any sense that we would tie the hands of the state of Alaska, the hands of our people, when we have the opportunity to responsibly and sustainably develop a resource that will increase national security of the United States and the prosperity of your state? Does it make any sense to tie your hands?
It does not.
And so based on your experience, I think, and these answers, this is not a situation where there's something new being proposed by Congress, actually something that Congress set forward to allow. Mr. Shaheen, it was mentioned your experience in the state of Utah, in the wildlife work in particular. Utah had, I think, 25 years in Utah. Is that correct, as a conservation specialist?
Yes.
The last 5 years prior to your appointment, you were running the state of Utah's Division of Wildlife Resources. You oversaw a significant increase in mule deer production. Is that correct?
That's true.
Utah's got a heck of a lot of energy production. Is that right?
In certain areas of the state, yes.
How do you balance that? How did you actually grow a population when you have that development? How do you balance that?
Well, I think the key to balancing any of that work is to try to avoid and minimize footprints the best we can. Our biologists and team members there work with those development companies to look at siting locations and have tried to develop those areas in the most responsible way that they can to minimize impact to wildlife numbers, and I think that we've seen some good success with those efforts.
And so based on your professional experience then, can we responsibly develop the resources that Congress has put in agreement with the state of Alaska and minimize impact to wildlife and other parts of the ecosystem?
Certainly, I believe that if that's developed, there can be similar efforts to minimize the impacts to wildlife in that 1002 area.
Thank you. My time has expired. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Gardner. We'll next go to Senator Franken.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One argument that we often hear from my friends across the aisle is that we need to open more federal land to drilling and in Alaska. But if you look at the facts, it's simply not true that.
More, and we do have votes coming up at noon.
We went 3 minutes over on two of our colleagues over here. Let him just
If
ask
it's
the
a quick
question.
question. Quick question.
I just want Mr. Alexander to summarize briefly the impact that this drilling will have on his people's way of life.
Senator Sanders, we believe that drilling in Izhik, Gotsan, Guantay Godlit will devastate us as a people. That will absolutely devastate us as a people, because you're talking about 80% of the diet of the Gwich'in people being Vitzai, that porcupine caribou herd. And so our connection to that is so strong that you're talking about just an absolute change in the way we live as people. And, you know, what about the next generation? Will they ever even have the opportunity to learn how to hunt caribou and to respect it? I don't know. And I'm hoping that you here today will protect that.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Senator Manchin.
Madam Chairman, I want to thank all of you for being here, and you can see this is quite divisive, if you will. But the bottom line is we live in a real world. We don't live in a fantasy world, and we can't pick what and choose.
There would have been a lot more activity, more wells previously. So.
My calculations are that it would have to be a little over $1,300 an acre in terms of bonus bids, which is about six times the historical average. I don't have a ton of time left. I guess I'll just end with this. I guess we have to come up with $1 billion, but we produce a lot of oil and gas in the state of New Mexico. There are some places we will never, ever drill. The Valle Vidal, the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. I think we need to be careful about what doors we're opening today, because we will not be able to undo this once a substantial reserve is found. And to find that $1 billion, I would never advocate mining for uranium in the Grand Canyon or doing geothermal resources in Yellowstone. And having been to the refuge, it's a wildlife refuge. That's why it's called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It is not a petroleum reserve, and we should remember that.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Chairwoman Murkowski and Ranking Member Cantwell, for convening this very important conversation. I also want to thank our witnesses who traveled far.
Schools, we need all these things. We're not saying give us money. What we're saying is let us live as Guchen. Because we already recognize the wealth that we have as people. And it's nothing that you can give us. We recognize it's something that can be taken away from us. And so when we talk about the land, and we talk about the caribou, it's in reverence to them. And you know, I keep hearing, well, the locals, let's hear what the locals have to say about the 1002 area. You know what the locals are? They're caribou. Those are the locals that don't have a voice. And that's why we're here as Guchen.
One of the things that really struck me about that geography was how the Arctic plain where the caribou calf is the flat place. To the west is, frankly, an industrial zone. Mm-hmm. You can say you can say birds nest on every drilling rig, but it doesn't look like that when you're there. And then to the south and to the east are mountains. Mm-hmm. And this is the place where the caribou